Slides. I'm Michelle, I'm a front-end developer, and one of my main hobbies is messing about with CSS on Codepen and creating interesting, or some might say pointless, demos. So I'm assuming most of you know what Codepen is, but for those who don't, it's a front-end playground where you can go all out making fun things without worrying about things like clients or browser support and all the things we love about our jobs. So today I want to tell you the story of how I created a recent Codepen demo, and it all starts with gradients. A lot of people have been redesigning their personal sites recently, and Cassie is one of them. We got a glimpse of her personal website in her talk just now, and if you haven't seen it, it's amazing, so you should definitely go and check it out. And all these people doing this have inspired me. I started thinking about ways that I could redesign my personal site and bring a bit more creativity and a bit more personality to it. And one of the ways I thought about doing this was using background gradients in CSS to make some geometric patterns. You might already know that you can create clean lines with CSS gradients using hard color stops. So if we want to transition between one color and another without a fade, we can use two consecutive color stops with the same value. Now, if we set the background size to a fixed value, then our gradient pattern is going to repeat and cover our backgrounds. And we could do a similar thing with radial gradients to create a spotted pattern like this. Or we could get even more creative and overlay multiple background gradients. And so this pattern has like 4 background gradients overlaid on top of each other. So you can get really creative and make some really cool patterns just with gradients. And we can use repeating gradients too to allow us to produce some really cool effects. So repeating linear gradient will give us this striped background where we have 3 colors which just repeat. We don't have to manually set every stripe in our gradient. Or we could use repeating radial gradient to get these concentric circles. And setting a fixed size again gives us some pretty cool effects. So our stripes join together and we get this interesting pattern. And different variations in the background size and the thickness of the stripes produce different patterns. Now, so far so good. I can create geometric patterns for my personal site using all of these different background gradients. But there's one thing that I'm really good at, and that's procrastination. So I still haven't even started my personal site, but I thought to myself, I'd quite like to create a zigzag background pattern. And I figured someone somewhere has already done this, but this is a learning exercise. I wanted to work out how I would do it and then see if there's a better way. So how would I do it? I started off creating a striped background with a 45-degree angle using repeating linear gradient, and that has a fixed background size. So our stripes just repeat in these kind of candy stripes here. Then I used an absolute position pseudo element with the same background but at the opposite angle. So this pseudo element covers our original element and has the same background gradient but with a minus 45-degree angle instead of a positive angle. And then I used the mask image property with a repeating linear gradient to mask the pseudo element with vertical stripes. So the original element is visible through the pseudo element. And I've left a bit of an overlay here so you can see where those hidden stripes would be. And this is the actual result. Now, I don't completely love this solution as it uses a pseudo element, and I kind of wanted this to be possible with a single element background. So I did a bit of searching around to see if anyone had a solution that was better than mine. And one of the results that came up was Leah Veroux's CSS Patterns Gallery from a few years back. And of course, if anyone has a solution to this, it's Leah Veroux. And there is a zigzag gradient pattern on the site, but with one crucial difference. It's only 2 colors. And I wanted my pattern to be 3 or more colors. So I searched around a bit more, but I couldn't find an example anywhere that was more than 2 colors. So that's not to say that it's not possible, but figuring it out was a little bit more than my tiny brain can handle right now. So I decided to stick with my solution for the time being. So once I had my zigzag gradient, I wanted to experiment a bit with the colors, the thickness of the stripes, and the size of the zigzags. Enter custom properties. Custom properties are among my favorite things in CSS. I use them in so many places, and they're perfect for when you have a value repeating in a number of places and you just want to tweak that value and have it update everywhere. So I can replace the gradient stops with a custom property, which represents the thickness of the stripes, and another that represents the background width. And I need to do this with the pseudo element too, but for brevity, I'm not showing all of the code here. This is just a little snippet of it. And I can just update that value to get different outcomes without changing anything else in the code. And we can replace some other values too. So here I'm replacing the angle with a custom property, and we can just adjust the angle of the zigzags by tweaking that single custom property in one place. So these values are needed for the initial element's background and for the pseudo element, but by setting a custom property, I only need to change it in one place because the pseudo element will inherit the new value. So we can update those custom properties and have an infinite number of variations for our background. But what would be even cooler than that would be if we could edit those values using a GUI and have our gradient pattern change before our eyes. Well, if we add some inputs and a bit of JavaScript, then we can. So with these range sliders, I can update the custom property every time the value changes. And this kind of works okay. The sliders will have a step increment of 1. So they're going to change by 1 pixel every time the value changes. But the change isn't that smooth because unfortunately gradients are not animatable in CSS, but not so fast. We can animate custom properties using Houdini. And I always struggle to explain exactly what Houdini is. So I'm going to quote right off of MDN, the Mozilla Developer Network. Houdini is a set of low-level APIs that exposes parts of the CSS engine, giving developers the power to extend CSS by hooking into the styling and layout process of a browser's rendering engine. Houdini consists of a bunch of APIs, but the one that's important for us here is the Properties and Values API. And that allows us to register a property with JavaScript and then animate or transition that custom property in exactly the same way you would a normal animatable CSS property. And that makes the gradient transitions just that little bit smoother, which is kind of nice. Support is currently limited to Chromium browsers, so it's not going to work in Firefox or Safari. And this website, ishoudinireadyyet.com, tells you how well supported the different APIs are. But in Chrome, at least, the gradient transition is just that little bit nicer. There's one part that I haven't really covered yet, and that's the color. So I could have 3 different color inputs and allow users to fully customize the color of the gradient stripes. But I quite like the idea of users being able to adjust the color via a slider rather than a drop-down or using color pickers, as that just seemed a little bit clunky. So once again, I'm going to reach for custom properties. And I like to use HSL when I'm working with custom properties and color. So HSL stands for hue, saturation, and lightness. And HSL is really nice to work with using custom properties because it allows you to tweak the color values really easily. In the gradient lab, I'm using a custom property for the hue value. So that's the first value in the HSL function. So the user can select the primary hue using the slider. So if we have an initial value of that hue of 0 degrees, that's going to give us this red hue. And the 2 other hues are calculated as adjacent colors from the opposite side of the color wheel. So that's known as a split complementary color scheme. And just a side note, this illustration on this slide is also made with CSS gradients and 1 element, just a fun fact. I could have just made it in an SVG in about 2 minutes, but I decided to spend 3 hours making it instead. So if the user changes the primary hue using the slider, then those other two colours are adjusted accordingly. They're always going to be from the opposite side of the colour wheel to the primary hue. So lastly, it would be pretty useful if once we have a gradient we like, it didn't reset the moment the user navigates away from the page or closes their browser window. So we can use local storage in JavaScript to store the values locally in the user's browser and then retrieve them and apply them as soon as the page is loaded. So now if you create a gradient using the Gradient Lab and you come back and visit the page later on, you'll still be able to get those values. It will remember the gradient that you created. So that's the story of how I made this little tool. I don't know if anyone will use it for anything real, but it was really fun to make and it's given me lots of inspiration for my personal site. So you can find the demo here on Codepen and I will share the slides after the talk as well. If you enjoyed this talk, I have a blog called CSS in Real Life where I write a lot about CSS, custom properties and general front-end explorations. And you can follow me on Twitter and I will post the slides on there too. So thanks very much for having me.